Hi, I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks for joining us today for the next conservative education agenda. We're joined by a terrific panel to talk about where conservatives should be on education in 2021 and beyond. It's an important conversation because, frankly, we've got to make sure we're offering real answers to families, to students, to educators who have been struggling through, close to a year of COVID disruption on top of everything else we've been wrestling with. And then secondly, speaking as a conservative, the last week has been an embarrassment for those of us who hold ourselves to be conservatives. It's been a travesty for the nation. And I think one of the ways that those of us who have the privilege of engaging on the public platform do better is by showing that we're interested in talking about real ideas and making a real difference for America's students and families. And that's what today's conversation is going to be on. The conversation is going to be kicked off by Mike McShane, Director of National Research for EdChoice, whose piece, Where Should Conservatives Lead in Federal Education Policy in 2021, was published by AEI Education yesterday. We also have the privilege of being joined by two terrific and seasoned educational leaders to help us think this through. One is former Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction, Lisa Graham Keegan. The second is former Kentucky Commissioner of Education and the inaugural Dean of the Belmont University College of Education, Wayne Lewis. Today, what we really want to be focused on is the principles and policies that should be guiding conservative education and K-12 and early childhood and higher education as we look to the first year of the Biden administration and beyond. Mike's going to kick us off by sharing some thoughts that draw on his paper. I'm then going to kick it over to Lisa and Wayne to offer some initial framing thoughts and reactions. And then we're just going to have a conversation. For the last 15 minutes, we're going to be opening it up also to audience Q&A. You can either share questions via Twitter at hashtag conservative education agenda. That's hashtag conservative education agenda. Or if you're as leery of social media as I am right now, you can email Haley Sinone directly. You'll see her email on the event invite, and she'll be able to share your question. That's our format today. We'll be wrapping at 3:30 Eastern sharp because I know our panelists are busy, and I know so many of you are wrestling with kids learning in the basement or at the kitchen table, just like many of us are, and you've got to go do your duty. So with that, Mike, would you be so kind as to get us started? When you talk about where should conservatives lead in federal education policy in 2021 and beyond, how are you thinking about this?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rick. I mean, the paper that I did was actually a really fun one because I think the brief that I got from the good people at AEI was over the course of the last year, they published this sketching a new conservative agenda, which was tons of smart people. I don't even remember how many pieces ended up being part of it. And sort of Rick reached out and said, hey, can we maybe try and draw some of these ideas together? What might some common themes be? What might be some things that the federal government can do to advance all of these great ideas? So I basically got to sit there and read a bunch of people whose ideas I really respect, some really interesting ideas. Some of them are in areas that I wasn't as familiar with. So it was, for selfish reasons, this was a really fun project. So I really appreciate that. And Rick, I think your comments that you offered to frame this, I think were really important. Trying to think about, obviously, in light of the last week and even the time before that, how to talk about something like this. I happened upon an old quotation from Russell Kirk, right, the great conservative thinker, from his 1956 book, Beyond the Dreams of Avarice. He wrote, I hope that beyond our dreams of avarice, there may lie not merely an age of gluttony, but a time of repentance and reform devoted to restoring the dignity of man. And he went on to say, we have the high duty of keeping alight amid the vandal flood, like Augustine of Hippo, the spark of principle and conscience. And I can't think of better to describe it than something like a vandal flood. And so it's really great to have this time to talk today with some wonderful fellow panelists about keeping that spark of principle and conscience alive. So the basic structure of the paper was that I tried to break it down into the main kind of issue areas that we think about in education, right? Early childhood, the time before children enter traditional K-12 schooling, those K-12 years, and then higher education. And again, pull together these great ideas that folks offered. So I'll be very brief with them. You can check out the paper, and obviously folks should check out the sort of source material of all of these things. But when it comes to early childhood education, a statistic that stuck out in my mind that I think should trouble all of us, but particularly conservatives, is some survey work that's been done by Lyman Stone, who's affiliated with AEI, who's found that routinely in surveys, American women end up having one fewer child than they would otherwise like to. So again, this is someone outside of their life says that they should, that their church or the economy or some demographer, but that people are not having as many kids as they would like to have. And all of us, I think, who are parents know what, an incredible joy children bring to our lives. And anybody who's sort of read, pick a conservative luminary, right? Edmund Burke, Russell Kirk, any of these people that talk just how important strong families and children are to our lives. And so, there's lots of reasons why that's happening. We don't have time to necessarily get into all of those. But I think part of it is just it's really expensive. It's expensive to raise kids today. And if you want to be a working professional and all those things, like it's tough. So some of the principles that I drew from these comments that were made is that number one principle is to provide relief for working families by subsidizing and promoting lower cost early childhood education options. The second one is to create nurturing and supportive childcare environments in partnership with employers and with the civil society. And finally, to directly support families to maximize their flexibility in finding workable childcare and early education options. So obviously that's all lofty. What might that look like? Again, drawing from both the Sketching a New Conservative Agenda, but also work, Rick, that you and others have done. Some of the policy ideas that were thrown out for this are creating education savings accounts for every 3- and 4-year-old in America, expanding tax credits for employer-provided childcare to try and work with employers to create these childcare environments, expanding the child tax credit and potentially making it refundable to help put more money just directly in the hands of families. And then also looking within the sphere of early childhood education and really thinking about, there have been big sort of in tandem pushes for more programs for early childhood education. There has been a lot of conversation about many more regulations related to them. And I think we as conservatives that maybe are a little bit more skeptical of those things can help work to make sure that those options don't become needlessly expensive because of all these regulations that people have to follow in order to comply with them. And to look in places like the civil society who are already able to offer these kind of safe and nurturing environments rather than maybe going directly to government operation. In the K-12 space, particularly looking at the federal government. Now, and again, the paper that I did is mostly about what the federal government can do. I imagine a healthy amount of the conversation we'll have today and much of the ferment of conservative education is what we should do at the state and local level. The big thing for me, the kind of principles of K-12 education reform, conservative education reform at the federal level, is about creating space for local actors and kind of broadening the eligibility of the types of people who can participate in federal programs. So what does that look like policy-wise? That looks like reforming Title I and IDEA to allow for more diverse groups to be able to participate in those, not necessarily having the local school district be the sole conduit of those funds, but looking for other ways to have, whether these are private, faith-based, any of these other organizations, serve low-income students, serve students with disabilities, and find ways to finance those. But if you stretch that out, if you think about it, the federal government spends a lot of money on teacher professional development, on academic enrichment, on school lunches, right? There's lots of things that the federal government spends money on. And the ways we could think about unbundling those, or more so putting them directly in the hands of teachers and families. So teacher professional development, trying to get that money directly to teachers in some sort of savings account where they could find the professional development that best fits their needs, not necessarily what the district's needs. Same thing around, it could be school lunches, academic enrichment, all of those things, just creating more flexibility around those. And then finally, looking at higher education. So the three principles that I tried to pull out from various conversations, the first one is rigor, right? That graduating with a bachelor's degree should mean something. That individuals who have a college degree should be able to write clearly and effectively. They should have a command of history, science, art, and literature. That I think conservatives really should understand that the universities play this really important role in shaping future citizens. And it sort of ties into the second, this idea of continuity, right? The university, in the highest sense, is about cultivating and conserving human knowledge. Universities should be dedicated to preserving what we have learned, sharing that with the next generation, and expanding what we know. So rather than having them be places of kind of more radical thought, where like our friends in the French Revolution, where every year is year zero, right, and there's nothing to learn from the past, but with our reason we can figure everything out. No, it's about cultivating and respecting the past, the great treasures of history, of art, of literature, of music, and passing those on. And then the third is about flexibility, right? A traditional college education is not for everyone, and I think we can recognize that. But for those looking to better their work opportunities, some education after high school is required. So we should work to have various paths for people pursuing different goals to gain the knowledge that they need for success. And I'll just highlight three really interesting policy ideas that came out of that series that I think are worth discussing. Michael Polyakov brought up this idea of the 3-year degree, having a much more focused path for students to get through higher education. It can be done in 3 years with the sort of core curriculum that has those grades that are major. I should say my wife is from Europe. She got a 3-year degree. It seemed to do fine for her, so maybe we could bring those here. Hannah Scandera, formerly the Commissioner of Education for the state of New Mexico, had this really interesting hybrid college idea, sort of working with people who are in the workforce in a much more flexible arrangement, providing the kind of wraparound services that they need so that they can get the higher education they need, which I think is great. And Michael Horn brought up this really interesting idea around third-party credentialing. So having outside folks develop tools to measure what's going on in universities that are recognized by industry and folks that are working out on the outside. And then obviously giving higher education institutions a lot of opportunities to find ways to meet those, but having that sort of outside check on the incredible amount of money that we spend in higher education. So look, I could talk about this all day, but I think I'll throw it back to my learned colleagues to discuss all of it.
Thanks, Mike. That's terrific. And yeah, thanks for pointing out, viewers who aren't familiar with it should absolutely go check out the new Conservative Agenda series. As you said, I think it's 24 pieces. We're still adding to it. In fact, Wayne Lewis has got a piece that I think goes up tomorrow. Right, this is what we need to be, what we should be putting forward: ideas, careful, reasoned ideas that are backed by evidence and careful analysis, and then we should argue about them. That's how we're supposed to do right by kids and families. Speaking of which, Lisa, I first met you, I think, quarter century ago when we were both much younger, although look that much younger. You still look like you do now.
Thank you.
But you had been leading the charge for charter schooling, of course, in Arizona and nationally, when that was still a brand new idea. And one of the ideas you've been pushing since, obviously, is this notion of dollars following students, that families should have more control over how dollars get spent.
Right.
So I'm just curious, as you listen to Mike, as you think about where conservatives need to be going, I'm interested in your general thoughts, but particularly in how you think about the role of money and how that should shape or drive our thinking here.
Well, Rick, thank you so much. And I think that should be our biggest agenda item. As you know, I really think this is so critical, and really because of first principles. I so appreciate Mike alluding to, great thinkers. And I told my own children, the way we do this really horrible moment is to listen to our better angels. And I have to say, I am a McCainiac, and I worked for John McCain, and we got the McCain alumni together this weekend with the McCain family and read his last words to the American people from 2 years ago. And I really recommend that to everybody right now. There's a reason that we became Republicans, and it feels very lost in this moment. And I think we have to get back to first principles. Speaking of which, to get back directly on topic, first principles are equal access for students. So the thing that I think we're great at articulating is a belief in freedom, and freedom as defined by, look, the constraints we all agree to create a civil society have to be imposed on us equally. And if we learned anything from this summer and all of the racial strife that is so at the forefront of the country right now, for those of us who went back and reread history that either we hadn't read recently or we'd never read, And I was informed about things that I should have been much more informed about. Darrell Bradford wrote a great piece about, the genesis of our school districts really mimicked redlining districts. And this is so important to remember, that equality wins when students are paid directly. That's how you solve for a school system that is built on inequity. We built a school system around districts. You get the money that is in your geographic area. And if you're lucky enough to be living in a wealthy place with the neighbors who are also wealthy, then you tax yourself at a pretty moderate rate and you raise a boatload of money, and that's your school system. And if you're in a poor area, or if you're forced into an area, or you don't, you just don't have the flexibility and people have not been giving you capital in your area the same way, that has not been the case. And it gets worse and worse and worse. And you can cut right through that by funding students directly. We started doing it with public charter schools. We started doing it with some of the ESA grants directly to students. And I really think we have to take this seriously. This is an equality move. And it is meant to get past these systems that we've built, where we say we're funding systems or we're funding students. And in the case of federal dollars, those dollars are meant to mitigate against poor circumstance for students, right? But they don't go directly to students. And I would argue they're some of the most inequitably dispersed dollars in education. I used to say when I was state school superintendent, and Wayne may have had this same sense, that the furniture and the carpet in the Title I area was really, really nice. And I know that schools that had a lot of Title I money also had, better furniture and carpet, but the kids didn't necessarily get that money. That money ought to go now directly to students and be allocated out into programs that states can say, look, we have these regulatory requirements. Totally legitimate, quality matters, right? So say what you want, but don't do it on the basis of a governance pattern or something arbitrary. Fund students. Just pretend they've got a little backpack, you put the money right in there, and the state gets to say who gets that money, but for God's sakes, don't just limit it to the 3 schools that are proximate geographically. This is the time for innovation, and God knows the pandemic has brought us to a place where we have to do this differently. Now is the time. And I think between the pandemic and what is hopefully an awakening on what we have done in terms of not just education systems, we got a lot of systems out there that are just horrendously culturally, from a heritage standpoint, unequal. We ought to be unapologetic about equalizing those. And the way that you do that is you fund students. Whatever formula, whatever differences are based on student need, but that formula ought to apply to all kids, no matter where they're going to school.
Thanks, Lisa. Wayne, one of the huge issues in these debates is always the role of teacher unions. It goes right back to what Lisa's talking about in terms of how dollars get spent, how systems get treated. Obviously, in your tenure in Kentucky, you were in the middle of some of these issues relating to teacher pensions and the rest. In light of what Mike said, in light of what Lisa put on the table, how should conservatives think about this teacher union question and about our relationship to the education profession more generally?
I think it's a great question, Rick, and it's an essential question for us to consider. No one should have any doubt that in order for us to come close to developing and implementing sound education policy, you must have teacher voice. There's a role for administrators and policymakers, many of us who started our careers as teachers. We bring that to bear in our administrative positions and our leadership positions, but there is no substitute for having the voice of teachers who are currently on the ground, giving us their input in terms of what these things look like, that the environment looks like, and what our ideas would look like as implemented on the ground. With that said, the teachers union is not the only way to ensure that teacher voice is a part of our considerations in the developing and implementing policy. One of the things that I found in my experience, and I won't make generalizations, but in my experience as a leader, the teachers union had become first and foremost a political organization. And I say that as someone who, from the time I was a classroom teacher, I was a member of the Teachers Union, the United Teachers of New Orleans. When I was in North Carolina, I was a member of the North Carolina Association for Educators, NCAE. I'm not saying this from a completely outside perspective, but for the time I was in government, first and foremost, it was about politics. And so because we realized that it was important for us to have teacher voice, we sought out and found great places to engage really thoughtful, incredibly talented and passionate teachers in our work. A few of those examples in Kentucky included working with the National Board Certified Teachers Network. Teachers who have really distinguished themselves and are more than eager and ready to engage and work with policymakers and leaders. We also work really closely with the Association for Career and Technical Education, which includes both teachers and administrators. Now, that's not to say at all, and I don't want to suggest that members of these organizations are not many times also members of the teachers union, because that is the case. There's a lot of crossover, but the leadership for the teachers union had come to the place where it was first and foremost about electoral politics, and there wasn't even the desire to find common ground and work together. So with that, I think we can't lose sight of the importance of engaging teachers, but not to believe the hype, the fallacy that the only way to engage teachers is going through the leadership of the state and national teachers unions.
Mike, one of the things where this stuff comes to play, obviously, when you look at like New York City's early childhood program, the United Federation of Teachers was very supportive. There's a lot of money flowing into the system. When I think about what you just said on early childhood, I could imagine some of our progressive friends saying, aha, I'm glad you agree with us now. We should spend a lot more on early childhood. So McShane, are you ready to sign on for a national version of de Blasio's New York City model? Is this what you mean? Conservatives, if they say, okay, I hear McShane, we've got to be for helping families dealing with their 3 and 4-year-olds. Is there a conservative vision that's different from that kind of New York City approach?
I think there is. And I think the primary one is sort of around the role of government in it and the amount of regulation that sort of comes with that. I think the conservative answer to this is to lean on the civil society, is to say that there are lots of that I think that it is fair to say that there are many 3 and 4-year-olds and even younger children who would benefit from care and education outside of their home, right? I don't think that's crazy to say. People need to work, people need to have all those things. But it seems to me that too many of our friends on the left basically want to take the traditional public school system and just like add on a few early grades to it and the bureaucratization and all of those pieces that come along with it. So to me, saying, no, look, we want to find nurturing and supportive environments for kids. But the big thing, I'll tell you what my hang up is, and I would be interested to hear, if the other panels are hung up on other panelists hear this. When you actually read some of these recommendations that advocacy organizations and others make about quote unquote high, you can't just be for pre-K, you have to be for high quality pre-K. But one of the things that's cited in that would be, for example, that like every pre-K teacher has to have a bachelor's degree. And it seems to me from a kind of casual view of the research literature, there's not necessarily a strong correlation between having early childhood teachers having bachelor's degree. And they've set class size requirements and all of those things. But you think to yourself, wow, that makes that really expensive. If suddenly we have a massive force of early childhood folks and every single one of them now has to get a bachelor's degree, you're going to constrict the supply, you're going to drive up the cost. I mean, those are the types of things where I think conservatives actually have something really constructive to say. To say, well, look, this idea in general works, but we have to think about, well, if you suddenly say everybody has to have a bachelor's degree, let's think through the steps of what the cost of that might be and how that might be restricted. So civil society, understanding the role of regulations, that to me is where I think conservatives can really make a substantive contribution to that conversation.
Wayne, Lisa, how do y'all think about this?
Mike, let me just add something to this. There are many examples around the country, and I'm thinking of places like in North Omaha and in South Phoenix and in other places. These childcare is a neighborhood function, and neighbors are paying each other a small amount of money. And there are times, and Omaha was one of them, when the district came in and overtook all the preschool stuff and put a ton of people out of work. And then they lost their incomes because they set a regulatory bar against a provider that was in the home doing a good job that families trusted, because now you didn't meet this silly bar, and it's a silly bar. I think quality matters, and there are ways to assess that. But one of the best ways you assess quality is, are parents putting their kids in that program? And in a neighborhood, and in low income neighborhoods, you've got a ton of superior childcare. And when you come in over the top and you say, now we're going to do childcare, down the street at a school with people you may or may not know, you're putting other people out of work. And the economy of small neighborhoods needs to be strengthened, and you need to go there first. So I think the biggest difference, Rick, in the way we're approaching this is, let's go find the providers who are actually getting this done first. We ought to be doing that everywhere. What is working? And particularly where income is a true need, then let's go there first and say, all right, you guys are doing a pretty good job. How do we strengthen this program? Let's get it. You can keep it private, do whatever you do. Let's bend our barriers and our rules to accommodate what is already working and popular in your neighborhood. And that is an economic strengthener. When you pull that out, you're taking a lot of money away from providers.
Lisa, how does your earlier point about backpack funding play into your thinking about early childhood, or doesn't it?
It works everywhere. I mean, you can damn near take it to the grocery store, Rick. Look, if children are valuable in the choice that they make in schooling, that's the value. It's the child, not me convincing somebody through a grant or whatever. The child is herself. That's how I'm going to get paid, if I serve her well. So same thing in early childhood, what we usually do is we go out, as Mike is saying, we create these behemoth programs with regulatory barriers in the extreme. So what the state has to do then is decide, look, who's a great provider? And if families want that, their children have this money made available to them. They can spend it where they want, so long as that provider is meeting whatever, requirements the state says. And my bias is that most of those regulations aren't necessarily for the benefit of the child. They're to create a culture and a system, not necessarily in the interest of the child. If the money is with the child when she chooses or when her family chooses, money goes to that provider.
Wayne?
Yeah, I think this is an area, back to your very first question, Rick, to Mike, we should be leading on this area. This isn't an area where we should shy away from, where we shouldn't be willing to talk about. First, with respect to quality and the quality dimension of this conversation, I am a big proponent of quality. When I was in Kentucky, we used federal early learning challenge Race to the Top funding to develop and implement a unified rating system for public preschool, for childcare, and for Head Start. I think that was a really positive step forward for the state in providing for parents a framework for understanding and evaluating the early childhood options that were available to them. So that is incredibly important. We do know as well from the research and from our data in Kentucky that if you are in a low-income neighborhood in Louisville, in terms of the dimensions of quality that we'd agree on, you are less likely to have access to higher quality early childhood options. That's an equity issue that we have to address. So quality is a dimension of this conversation that has to be there. There are other dimensions that we don't talk nearly as much about. And these are areas where I think conservatives have the opportunity and should be leading. Early childhood is without a doubt a workforce development issue. If people don't have access to safe and high quality places to leave their children, they cannot go to work.
Right.
They cannot get training, right? They can't earn degrees and do the things that we want them to be able to do to be productive citizens and move our economy forward. So the workforce dimension is absolutely missed, and it is ripe for conservatives to lead on that space. The other place is access. And these are not disconnected, but as we think about quality, there's an integrated element of access that we can't mistake. And to make this really plain, in Kentucky, there are pockets in our Eastern Kentucky Appalachian region where it doesn't matter what you want for childcare or for early learning for your kid, there is none. Right? There are still pockets where there is absolutely no place where you can leave your child. That happens in some of our urban centers as well. So the quality dimension and the access dimension, they're integrated. You have to consider them together. And there's a cultural dimension to this as well. Lots of folks think that, the answer is we just flood more money into the system. We put more money and we can expand access and we'll have all this great quality. There are lots of folks in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, we found, who state funds and federal funds are already allowing access to childcare, but they're not accessing it because they don't believe that that's a better option than having little Susie or Johnny stay home and play while mom and dad are watching TV. And so there's another space for us to move as conservatives, is helping people to understand that the brain science is clear. Early learning is important. If we can get young people into early learning environments, it can and it will, especially for our lower income kids, have a dramatic impact on their learning as they move forward in their academic careers.
Thanks, Wayne. Mike, I want to shift gears here. When you talked about higher ed, one of the first things that strikes me is I think many of us on the right have become, I think, justifiably frustrated over time with what feels like a campus monoculture, which feels like professorial associations and campus leadership that over the last 20 years ago seem to have read themselves into the Democratic coalition. But I do wonder, when we think about how to engage in higher ed, the role of higher ed, how to approach higher ed reform, whether we've got ourselves stuck in a culture war sometimes in a way that closes the doors to some of the thinking you were just talking about. Curious kind of how you think about that, how we should think about universities and the role of higher ed.
Yeah, something, you and I wrote a piece earlier this week for Newsweek that I think is a helpful way of framing the way we think about higher education, the way we think about universities, but that we may want to think about others. Yuval Levin, an AEI colleague, wrote a fantastic book last year called A Time to Build, and talked about the importance of institutions in our lives, the lack of trust, the decreasing trust we've seen in institutions, and that many of the social problems that we have right now is because many of these institutions, we've lost trust in them, we've lost the way they connect us to one another. And one of the points that he made, and he drew it across a couple different areas, but I think it's particularly important for education, is the difference between formative institutions and performative institutions. And to me, the way conservatives should speak about higher education is that they are formative institutions. These are places where people go to be exposed to great thinkers and great thoughts and art and literature and history and all of these things. And it helps form them to think and to reason and to become better people and better citizens and others. And at the same time, the adults, the professors, the administrators, they too should be formed by that institution. And they should recognize what their role is. I think one of the big problems that we've seen, and I want to be clear, this is something that we've seen across the political spectrum. We see it in some sort of conservative institutions who really have leaned into politics in recent years. But we've seen universities as these performative, that professors see their position as a platform for their political agenda, or they see their job as training their students to be political activists, as opposed to sort of forming them in the knowledge that they need. So I think it's actually something that conservatives should definitely support. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are actually more people, more moderate people, more people on the progressive side that say, yeah, this whole kind of campus culture where things have become increasingly political, where there's a lot of the sort of performance happening, where we want to, think of all of these, mass letters that have been signed trying to excommunicate someone for some paper that they wrote or something. Like, this is all this performative stuff that we need to get away from. So to me, it's rephrasing that and saying, well, what is the purpose of these institutions? And again, I think that's something a lot of people can get behind. That universities are supposed to be formative institutions, and that it takes both students and faculty playing in a role to get back to that.
Wayne, I mean, you sit in the middle. You're a dean of the School of Education. How do you think about these challenges of higher ed?
We would be foolish to think that there's not, as Mike is saying, a serious political thread, political dimension to what's happening on campuses. I'll start personally, Rick, in terms of my role as a dean, right? So I serve students, serve faculty, serve staff who come from different political and ideological perspectives. And to Mike's point, especially in higher education, it's my role to be respectful and be supportive of their work, regardless of their background and political ideology. I do worry that we have and we are moving too far away from the place where we value ideological diversity of thought, and even to the place where faculty, staff, and students can be fearful in some cases of expressing who they are and what their beliefs are. I think it's incumbent upon us as a nation and as a sector, as a higher education sector, to dial that back and ensure that, especially, for me in training and preparing teachers, that we make sure that our colleges and universities are safe places of learning where people can explore and hear different ideas and different viewpoints. And we ought to protect that at all costs. I think it's not only important for higher education, I think it's important for the future of our nation.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, what can we do about this? What are a couple ideas that, people who don't just want to shout, but want to act might look to?
Well, I think it's really important. I so appreciate what Mike and Wayne have said about this and the importance of valuing ideas. That's the place of the academy. I also think part of it is, Rick, as with our other systems in education, you have to allow the successful players to teach the rest of us about what they do. And I think that there's been far too much ideology in what a university has to look like. So we're only going to allow this, and this without regard to whether students are graduating. Are they getting jobs? Are they, what is the culture of the campus? And does it allow everybody to, evince their own opinions, articulate their opinions, and also, does it teach them how to listen? Does it teach them? And so, this ideology about, well, university has to be a state school, or, the Department of Ed has really, I think, gone kind of haywire in what it thinks a university is. I understand we've had bad players in the for-profit space, for example. We also have exceptionally good players in that space. And, we've got nonprofit private players that are amazing. And somehow we got to get past all of this nonsense about, I'm going to judge you on the basis of my ideology before I ever know anything about you. Whether you're an institution or a person, it's anti-intellectual. And I think for those of us who are working in education, we got to be way up here and just call that what it is and not behave that way ourselves ever. God forbid that we do that same thing. We just have to make sure that we're constantly explaining, as you point out, Rick, this is why we believe what we believe. This is really important. So I need to at least have you listen to me about what is happening for kids in this institution that you don't think you like, because it's, name it, private, for-profit, whatever. Okay, well, here's what happens for the students there. That seems productive. It's a road to hoe. Starts with us.
I like it. One of the big issues that's going to frame this year, obviously, is it's a very safe bet there's going to be a lot more federal aid coming down the pike for schools, for colleges, for states and localities. One thing conservatives can say is, we don't think we should spend this much more. A, it's probably going to happen regardless, and B, it seems like a difficult moment for conservatives to suddenly plead fiscal rectitude the last 4 years. So while we should absolutely have the green eye shade conversation, if dollars are being spent and are coming down, what should conservatives be for about how these federal dollars ought to be directed, about what they should be directed towards, about the conditions that ought to be attached? How should folks across the land be thinking about what they should be pushing for, either in Washington or in their states and communities?
Rick, just really quickly, I think one thing we should look for are areas of commonality. I think Wayne used the expression crossover. Education, those of us who've been doing it for a while, we have the privilege of knowing that the big ideas that we've managed to push forward as policy came because of crossover. Education is not, in my experience, so much a partisan issue as it is whatever the traditional status quo is versus the ability to move forward. And we've got a lot of Democrats and Republicans on both sides of both, right? So for those of us who want to move forward, I think that's a good place to get common cause in as these dollars begin to come out. Where do we agree? I completely agree with you, Rick. Now, there's a bunch of things we shouldn't do. One is pretend that we're fiscally conservative as a party, because that happened. I can hardly even remember. Secondly, I don't think we ought to engage in some of the poking the stick at people stuff. First of all, I don't like it. So that's my bias, but I don't like anything that says we're going to devalue a whole class of individuals, youth, and students by focusing on issues like where can we go to the bathroom and stuff like that. And I'm just going to be really blunt here. That will decimate credibility. I'm so tired of it. And it's affiliated, in people's minds, I think with our party. So I'm done of just sitting there and going, oh, that's okay too. That's not okay. If we're about, look, all of these beautiful kids came from the Creator, they all deserve ultimate opportunity, and we are going to be about opening doors for them to get it. And if more money is coming, then let's make sure that doors are open so it can follow kids into those programs that are fitting them. I think we put that front and center when we go looking for friends on other sides of the aisle. There's some possibility there.
So if you take Lisa's advice and we're thinking about, hey, what should we be fighting for that we might be able to find allies on, that we might be able to enact in Washington or when these dollars are coming down to states and communities? Mike, Wayne, what would you encourage folks to be thinking about, to be pushing for?
So I think, Rick, and I'll expose my ideological positioning here. I think public education systems belong to states. And so I believe funding from the federal government should, in the vast majority of instances, be granted to states. And then for states to make decisions according to their laws about how those dollars get allocated. Now, with that said, I don't believe it would be a good thing for the federal government just to start writing blank checks to states. I think funding should, for the most part, be categorical and have some reasons attached to those dollars in the way that the federal government has historically used education funding. But with that said, categorical dollars that go to states with pretty broad discretion for states within their laws and parameters to disperse those dollars, how states make those decisions. And what we can't get into as a nation is the federal government just flushing more money down to the states, and then states using those dollars in ways that that are not transformative for their systems, and do not benefit children. Because the reality is you can spend a lot more money doing the exact things that we're doing now and that we've done in the past and have absolutely no difference whatsoever in terms of the outcomes for children. And that, if COVID has done anything positive for us, I believe it has brought more people to recognize that the system as currently constructed, regardless of how much more funding you put into it, is inequitable. And to some extent, putting more money into an inequitable system will only exacerbate inequity. So that cannot happen.
I'll throw two things out there. One, I think, as a big school choice guy myself, I recognize that advocating for school choice is much harder when it's a zero-sum game, right? I don't think it should surprise us that many of the places where we've seen the most growth of school choice are in states where the student population is growing. So you're less threatened by a new charter school if your enrollment is going up and it's like, oh, well, they're going to put it in charter school, but we're getting more, we've got more money, we're getting more teachers, we're getting all of the stuff that we need. So it's less threatening. When your enrollment is declining and a new charter school is going to come in, suddenly that fight gets extra vicious. So I think on one level, using this funding as an opportunity to create fewer zero-sum situations where new and different folks can have a try at things, to say, look, a bunch of federal money is going to come in. Some small sliver of that new money is going to go to private schools or new operators or any of these sort of things at micro schools and things that were all in the sketching the conservative education agenda. I think that's actually an opportunity. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can try some new and different things. This is the other thing that I think has been looming in sort of school finance, but also state finance for a very, very long time, and that's pensions, right? Public sector pensions in states across the country. There are many of them that are in an absolutely dire shape, and part of that is because there's just, kicking the can down the road forever has put current policymakers in a series of no-win situations. Now, I don't want to sort of reward states for that behavior, right? I don't want to let them off the hook. And there are many states that have reworked their pension systems to be able to be more fiscally responsible. But I do think there have to be some opportunities there, because if we don't get our state pension houses in order and move people towards more hybrid plans or defined contribution plans as opposed to defined benefit plans, that is going to be just this ticking bomb that's always out there. So something around using some of these dollars to rethink pensions, and that may be saying to get teachers to switch, using some of this money to encourage them to do that. Because if we don't fix our pension house, that's going to cause problems for the next 2 or 3 decades.
Rick, can I just say something really quick on pensions?
Given that you live this, sure.
So I served in a state where, we had, one of the worst public funded pension systems in the nation. And the irony about the incredible vitriol that comes from any conversation and attempt in some cases to make changes to teachers' pension systems is this. Two really big ironies. One is when you're talking about making changes for the younger generation of teachers, for teachers who are coming into the system and who will be coming into the system in the time being, in most instances, the changes states want to make actually align with what those young people want. So it's not like your states are talking about, usually conservative states, they're not usually talking about making changes to pension systems that run counter to what younger people want. What younger people tend to want flexibility. They tend to because they're not going to do, research tells us they're not going to do the same thing for 20, 30 years. They want employer contributions to be able to follow them. They want something that they can take in a package and then put with their next career and their next job. That aligns with some of the ideas that you see happening in conservative states. But our friends in the teachers unions have been so anti these moves, which, it doesn't make a lot of common sense. I think it's right that they would want to protect the benefits that have been promised to people who are already in the system. I think once a state has made promises to teachers, and that's been a part of the deal, a part of the package that they signed up for, I think it's a very different conversation to start talking about pulling the rug from under people and doing something different. But in thinking about how we move forward, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And clearly what we're doing now is not helpful in attracting the next generation of teachers, because the proposition that, hey, come into the system, this is what your pension system looks like, your retirement system looks like. Oh, you've actually got to be here for 10, 15, 20 years before you can actually take anything with you that your employer has contributed. No. I mean, young people aren't hearing that. It's really a common sense move that can save dollars. And every dollar we are throwing down the tube, and I literally say that, throwing down the tube on really ill-constructed pension systems are dollars that we cannot spend on instructional purposes, on teacher salaries. It's all education funding that could be repurposed in much more productive ways.
Great. So we've got some questions stacked up here. Let's try to address them pretty briskly, so we don't all have to speak each question, and let's just try to, and we'll see if we can get to several of them. First up, obviously, we're looking at budget reconciliation coming on Capitol Hill, which is likely to contain expenditures for student debt relief and other priorities. So really two questions. One, what would be appropriate means-tested policies? What are a couple ideas that would be a good use of these funds? And two, should conservatives be thinking about supplemental education services, about tutoring programs as part of the response to the challenges we're looking at here?
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the federal government already spends a lot of money on things like enrichment activities and others. I think sort of borrowing from Lisa, I mean, these are the types of dollars that could be put in something like an education savings account at the state level to find the option that works best for them. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. I just think it's important that students have the flexibility to find the right, the right outlet to spend them.
Is there a version of student loan forgiveness or of higher ed outlays that would be more appealing in a principled sense?
It's so rough, Rick, because, you know, for those who have done everything they needed to do to pay back these loans, that's where my mind keeps going, is that it just feels like such a bad faith move. So I am not the right person to ask about all of the details of this. My sense is means testing for sure, and then some. I don't know. I don't know how you reward people who went in and paid their loans back. That's the most disheartening part of all of this. And I mean, it for sure, it's got to be fixed, but I don't think you do it in a way that permanently damages people's trust in, you know, good behavior.
You know, honestly, Lisa, I'm not the best person to ask about that one either. In addition to the point you make, I think what's often missed is the incredible swath of the American people who not only could pay back their loans, but who did not go to college, right? Or who went to two-year colleges or much less expensive options where they cash flowed their options. And I'm saying that personally as somebody who writes that check out to Navient every single month and probably will be for quite some time. But I think that's a serious consideration. On the supplemental education question that you asked, though, Rick, I think we would be really short-sighted to not recognize from the very beginning that we're not digging out of this incredible hole that we're in academically in terms of kids' preparation for college and the workforce with just what happens from 8 to 3:30 in a school building.
Yeah.
It is essential that we think about how we're going to be able to fund supplemental education services that are provided by school districts, by churches, by community organizations. And as Mike said, there has to be some flexibility to give people options and find the ones that work best for their families as well.
On a related note, there's a growing push to connect education and workforce. What can be done to better share data and promote public-private partnerships? You know, in high school and community college to help prepare folks for these jobs?
10-second answer in the Sketching and Conservative Education Agenda, Hannah Scandera's piece on hybrid college. Everyone should read it. It's awesome. And that would answer that question.
Yeah, I think that's right. Rick, I was also going to say, let's take a look at universities and community colleges or other places that have not raised tuition on the flip side of this for giving all this debt. How about not charging people for things that are just exorbitant? And we do have in the country a host of universities that froze tuition maybe 10 years ago, are doing an exemplary job. Let's go ask them how they did that. Don't penalize them, in this whole deal. But I agree on Hannah's paper. That's a great resource for making these connections and not hoping that they happen.
I'll brag on Kentucky a little bit. I think one of the big strengths of Kentucky is its data infrastructure. Kentucky has a P20 longitudinal data system that connects the education system to the labor force in a way that is incredible. And the state's Kentucky Center for Statistics puts out this post-secondary, they do high school and post-secondary feedback reports that are incredibly valuable. I don't think they're having nearly the degree of impact or penetration in the general population that they should. But here's what they do. They say to consumers, to parents, to kids, but for people who graduate from these high schools, for people who finish with degrees or certificates in these programs at the post-secondary level, this is what their lives look like, right? So 3 years out, 5 years out, are they employed? Are they employed in their sector? What are their economic outcomes look like? Those are the type of information we need to get in the hands of kids and parents on the front end as they're making decisions about what programs, what colleges, what universities they want to go into.
Given that, given the, it was graciously termed here, given events at the Capitol, let me rephrase it. Given that a Republican president has spent 2 months denying he lost an election that he clearly lost after extensive litigation and fact-finding, given that he has denied losing an election that he lost, and that the right-wing kind of media ecosystem has largely supported him in these false claims, how should conservatives, and then that he incited a mob to attack Congress, how should we as conservatives think about the issues of constitutional literacy? How should we think about the challenge when it comes to citizenship, to civics, to core knowledge? What are our marching orders here?
Well, for one thing, Rick, we need to say out loud what you just said. That's exactly what happened. And we need to congratulate high school teachers who've been explaining that to their kids. And there's been a lot of political writing around high school teachers shouldn't get into this, et cetera. Baloney. They absolutely have to get into this. They have to explain to their students what it looks like. The peaceful transfer of power in this nation is sacrosanct, and it's been violated in horrific ways. And that's not a party issue, that's a country issue. And our children need to understand what happened. Now, it doesn't have to be overly politicized, et cetera. It's just a fact. We need to talk about it. And we need to make sure that we are teaching these things, that character, culture, these are the things that make a nation, and that make a fine individual. And we shouldn't apologize for teaching those things and wanting those things taught. And we should make sure that they aren't taught in partisan ways, but this is not partisan. This is a really unfortunate reality.
Yeah, I think one of the things to think about. Go ahead,
go ahead, Mike.
Well, I'll jump in. Okay, okay.
I was going to say we need to acknowledge that in too many instances, kids simply aren't taught social studies. Right. So, I mean, we've had movement on the civics exams that's happened, across a lot of states, which, put some emphasis on social studies. But literally, there are too many across our states, elementary kids who literally have no social studies instruction. And in many cases, it's as simple as, well, it's not tested at the end of the year, so we're not going to teach it. That's simply not okay. We shouldn't be surprised when Americans grow up and get to the place where they can vote and they have no idea how to even think about that decision when we're not teaching in our schools. It's just not acceptable.
I agree.
Mike, we're at our end time. So how about last words? Speak to this, but it seems like a good topic also for us to go out on.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the big point here is that that civics is not just a collection of facts. So it's important that we don't just say, the kids know what the Fourth Amendment says or what the Third Amendment says, right? It's a series of values and norms, and I think exactly what words we heard, like character and culture, and that there are many things that can be done that are technically constitutional or legal, but that are serious violations of norms. And so I think that we should not shy away from talking about that in our school, things like the peaceful transfer of power, and these are values, these are norms that we have that have to be valorized, and that have to be passed on, because if we don't pass them on to our children, we should not be surprised when we don't continue to have them in the future.
I mean, one of the things that just listening to you guys is clear, right? There have to be policies that we're for, because policies are how we spend money. It's how we run schools and colleges. It's how we serve students and their families. But underneath that, there's got to be principles that we're passionate about. And it's a mistake when we get so caught up in policy argument that sometimes we can lose sight of underlying principles. So thank all three of you for bringing us back to those first principles for this conversation. We'll be having a series of these conversations going forward, more focused on K-12 and early childhood and higher ed. Because look, if there's anything that a place like AEI should be focused on, I think, this year and looking forward, it's always bringing us back to these questions of how do we actually equip ourselves and our students to pursue the American creed. And, thanks for doing it today in the shadow of recent events. I think it's more important than ever. And thank you guys for all the work you do and for making the time.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Take care, all.